Now, you're perfectly familiar with pressure waves in the atmosphere that you can hear. We call them sound waves. And I'm using this recorder in order to generate a particularly simple kind of pressure wave. It's a sinusoidal wave. And we're displaying it electronically. Let's have a look at that again. Well, I'm sure my performance will mortify any real recorder player, but at least it was more or less sinusoidal. But what about this? Well, once again, there were pressure waves present, and they were certainly of a much higher frequency. In fact, they were so high in frequency that we couldn't hear them. But dogs can. I was blowing on a dog whistle. Let's have another look. There we are, pressure waves of frequency above what we can hear. Now, because they're of such high frequency, we call them ultrasonic, because ultrasonic means above sound. And also because of their high frequency, they're useful in imaging, because high frequency means short wavelength, means high resolution. Now, in this program, we're going to have a look at how ultrasonic waves are used to image both the human body and metals as well. But we're going to start with a demonstration that makes ultrasonic waves visible. If we can't hear them, at least we can see them. Here is David Creecraft to take up the story.
We're looking at ultrasonic waves in a glass block. I'll just switch off for a moment. The apparatus we're using to show these waves was developed by British Rail at Derby. Here's the glass block, and on top there's an ultrasonic transducer which sends waves down into the glass. You'll notice that there are some bubbles in this particular block, and I positioned the transducer so that the waves at the moment will miss the bubbles. Now, we're visualizing the waves by a technique known as photoelasticity. We send light through a polarizer here, through the glass block, through a second polarizer. The light bounces off a mirror, goes into a TV camera, and the picture appears on this monitor. I've still got it switched off at the moment. Photoelasticity enables us to see static stresses, but of course ultrasonic waves are dynamic stresses, and what's more, the waves move. So to make them appear stationary, we use a stroboscopic technique. What we do is we flash the light at the same rate as we send the ultrasonic pulses out. Let's switch on. Now, at the moment, you can see the wave packet or train of pulses just here. And in fact, the light bands you can see are the peaks of the stresses in the ultrasonic wave. So each of these is a cycle or a wavelength in the glass. At the moment, the light is being flashed just a little bit later than the transmitter transmits from that point, so that by the time the wave gets to there in the block, we flash the light and we see it stationary. Now, if I turn this knob, we can increase the delay, and the wave appears at later and later times as it propagates through the block. I go right down to the bottom of the block, and now you can see the wave bouncing off the bottom. It reflects from the bottom and comes back up to the top as we put in more and more delay, until finally I can see the wave hitting the transducer again. Now, it's this situation which is commonly used in flaw detection for looking for defects in opaque materials. So I'll wind this back to there. Let's look at the actual waveforms on the transducer. Now, on this oscilloscope, you can see at the top here is the transmitter waveform, and down the bottom is the waveform that the transducer receives and converts back into an electrical signal from the bottom of the block. There are one or two other echoes in there from some of the defects in the block. Now, to remind you of where this signal comes from, we'll look back at the waves again. I'll switch on again. Now, I'm showing the oscilloscope waveform at the same time. So there's that echo I was talking about from the bottom. And to remind you, let's move the visualization system delay so that we see the echo hit the bottom and come back up to the top. Now, you'll notice while I'm doing this, there's a waveform which is moving through there, which is breakthrough of the signal which triggers the lamp. So, in fact, you can see that we're triggering the lamp now. At that time, when the signal hits the transducer again, which coincides with the received signal. Okay, well, I'll bring that back to there again. Now, what about the bubbles that we talked about earlier on? You can see them in the block, in fact, there. What I need to do is to move the transducer, and we should be able to see signals coming back from these defects. So I'll do that now. Well, now you can see an extra echo signal on the transducer in this vicinity, and another one there from some of these bubbles in the center of the block. Let's see if we can decide which is which. It looks as though that one might be coming from somewhere in this region. So I'll move the wave down to the visualization system. Now you can see a wave reflecting off this big bubble in the middle and coming back up to the transducer. And in fact, if you look at the oscilloscope, you can see that the electrical signal that's breaking through, it shows us that it is, in fact, just there. So that signal there is coming from there, and then there are others from these other bubbles. Well, now, ultrasonics is used for looking at opaque objects. All we've done with the glass, of course, is to actually visualize the waves so you can see what's actually happening. Well, now let's look at an opaque object, this time a steel block. Well, this is the steel block. If I put this ultrasonic transducer on it, you can see when I get the coupling right, there's a signal coming from the other side of the block. Now, if I move the transducer towards the center, up comes another signal. There's evidently a hole of some sort at about half the thickness, somewhere around here. And in fact, if we look at the back of the block, you can see there's a hole drilled up inside it, because this is a test block. Now, so far, we've seen the waves, the ultrasonic waves, as they actually appear, but it's quite common on machines like this, which is in fact a flaw detector, to rectify and smooth the wave like that. So, and this is amplified as well, so we get a simpler display. And another facility that this sort of machine has is that we can move a range gate or time gate, which you can see I'm moving now, into the vicinity of a flaw. And when that happens on this particular one, you can hear there's an alarm signal goes. Well, now Ian Lowe is going to describe a medical application of this ultrasonic pulse echo technique, and he'll be referring back to this time gating.
This is building up something similar to what you may already have seen in the printed unit, an ultrasonic image of a human fetus. So how do we go about getting an ultrasonic image of something as complex as a fetus inside a human uterus? We built a model to show you the principles involved. It's based on a transducer, which acts as a source of ultrasonic waves, and it also collects the reflections and channels them away to be processed electronically. We're going to look at a so-called A scan, which is the type of scan that David showed you, and it's a simple echo ranging device, and on the screen you can see two blips, two echoes. In this case, one is coming from one of the objects in the simulated cross-section through a pregnant stomach, and the second one is coming from the bottom of the model. The A scan is a simple echo ranging device, but in the case of the human fetus, we want information about the shape of the whole reflecting surface, so we use a different type of scan. It's based on the so-called B scan, in which the brightness of the trace is modulated by the reflection. If I press this button, we can get a B scan, and here you can see the brightness is brought up in the two places where there was a reflection. I can move the transducer, and we now lose that first reflection, and we get a second reflection from the second object inside this mock-up that we've built. By scanning the transducer round and building up and storing all of these B scans, we can produce an entire picture of the contents of this model. Scanning the transducer around in exactly the same way as one would scan the transducer over the stomach of a pregnant woman. It's very important to maintain the transducer in contact all the time with the surface. And we've used a thin film of oil to give good contact. And by the time I get right round the other side, we should have built up quite a reasonable picture. And we've now built up on the screen a picture that looks vaguely like the contents of the model. Of course, the building up of this composite picture is critically dependent on monitoring the position and angle of the transducer all the time so that the scans are put together in the proper order. There's one more thing that we can do to improve this picture. As in the fetus inside the human uterus, a large part of this picture contains no information because a large part of the volume of the model, as the volume of the uterus, is water or amniotic fluid in the case of the uterus. And a way of improving the resolution of the picture, the information content, is essentially to amplify the part we're interested in by cutting out signals that are reflected either from above the object of interest or from well below the object of interest. Now, since there's a time scale involved in the ultrasonic wave going down and being reflected back, by imposing a time gate and cutting out those pulses that arrive too early or too late, it's possible to select one part of the picture, one part of the volume under investigation, and amplify that. We can show you the sort of thing that you get by giving you a close-up picture of the object on the right. Well, those are the principles of ultrasonic imaging. Let's look at how ultrasonic fetal imaging is carried out in practice. Fetal imaging uses the technique that we've just been demonstrating with the model. A series of B scans are put together side by side to build up a composite picture of the fetus inside the uterus. The transducer is tracked slowly across the stomach of the pregnant woman, and a thin film of oil is placed on the stomach to ensure good contact. The series of B scans gradually build up a composite picture on the screen behind. The resolution can be very good as a millimetre. Let's look at the picture as it builds up. A series of B scans gradually accumulating into the outline of the fetus with the head in the bottom right-hand corner.
Well, this is another ultrasonic machine which was developed here at the Non-Destructive Testing Centre at Harwell. In this case, it's scanning automatically, and there's a probe mounted underneath this carriage, and we're inspecting a steel block which is at the bottom of this tank, which is full of water. Another difference is that this time the output is being recorded on a chart recorder. And the complete recording looks something like this. Well, now that doesn't look like anything that's recognizable at all. That's simply because this is an ultrasonic hologram. To reconstruct this hologram, we reduce it to a 35mm transparency, which is mounted on an optical bench. Now, the object that this particular hologram was made from is a brass block, this brass block. And you can see that there's a hole drilled down this side and another hole drilled down this side. And if you look at this X-ray, you can see where the holes lie within the block. Well, the reconstruction technique from then on is conventional. There's a laser. We pass light through the hologram, through a lens, and an image, or images are formed in the back focal plane of this lens. And then there's a stop to select the image we want. In this particular case, there's then another lens so that I can adjust the focus through the hologram. And the light from that lens is then picked up by a TV camera. Well, you can see the outline of the block here, the square outline. On the right-hand side, you can see a blurred image of a fixing screw. And lying horizontally along the center is a fairly sharp image of one of the holes in the block. Now, I can move the focusing lens I just talked about. I'll move it back, which throws that image out of focus, and now you should be able to see there's an image coming into focus, which is a vertical line in the center of the picture, which in fact is the other hole which lies at the back of the first one. Now you can see straight away that although we've got a sharp image of that, it's still confused by a blurred image of the first hole. And this is one of the difficulties of ultrasonic holograms. The wavelength is so long compared with that of light that we get rather serious diffraction images compared with the case in optics. Now if I take the focus back again, focusing through the first hole I talked about, the horizontal one, and then forward, and I'm beginning to come into focus on the front face of the block, or rather in the reconstructed image we're coming into focus. And now you can see fairly sharp blobs in around the centre of the picture, which are in fact indentations on the surface of the block. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see an almost vertical line of dots. This turns out, in fact, to be a scratch on the surface of the block. Now, you can see this. If you look closely, it's just here. And here are the surface indentations I was talking about. Well, that's how we reconstruct the hologram by the conventional optical means. But how do we record the original ultrasonic hologram? Well, this diagram shows an ultrasonic analogue of the optical situation. The ultrasonic transmitter takes the place of the laser, and that sends a beam of plane waves down to a reflector. The waves bounce off, forming a reference beam, which goes up to the recording plate. Some of the beam from the transmitter hits the object, and the waves that scatter off are directed, or at least some of them are directed towards the recording plate, where they mix with the reference beam. Now, this is fine, except there's no such thing as the ultrasonic equivalent of an optical recording plate and a photographic emulsion. So what do we do? Well, this next picture shows us the solution. Rather than the plate, we have a scanning ultrasonic transducer, or probe. And this is virtually a point source receiver, and it scans across the surface, picking up the waves in that plane point by point. And as it does so, the output is recorded on the chart recorder, point by point, so forming the hologram. Now, this is a somewhat clumsy arrangement because the reference beam has to be reflected off a plate. So this next picture will show us what we can do about that. In this particular case, we still have the transducer which is generating the beam down onto the object. But rather than having a reflecting plate, I'm also sending the signal which generates the ultrasonic waves to a multiplier. So now we're multiplying an electrical reference signal with the electrical signal from the transducer. Now, multiplication is what we need to form a hologram, of course, and then the output goes to the chart recorder. Now, you've probably noticed there's an extra item in this diagram, the phase shifter. What's that for? Well, if we look back at the previous diagram, and look in the region of the reference beam where it reaches the recording plane, where the scanning probe is. I've shown the wavefronts there, and you should be able to see that as we move across that plane, we're moving from one wavefront to another, so there's an effective phase shift from point to point. So if we're going to reconstruct, or rather simulate, a reference beam electrically, we've got to have an electrical signal which progressively changes phase. So if we go back to that third diagram again, what it means is that we have this phase shifter whose phase must increase progressively in synchronism with the mechanical movement of the transducer across there. And that's what's done. Okay, so that's removed one of the clumsy aspects of the previous arrangement, but there's still some snags with this. This needs to be rather a big transducer in order to produce a wide enough beam to illuminate the object. And this one, because it has such a point source, rather point receiving probe, is necessarily rather insensitive. So the next arrangement goes one better. In this case, we only use one transducer. It's a common transmit-receive transducer, located here. We drive this electrically, and it transmits waves which propagate down through here, through a focusing lens. And this has the action of focusing the rays down to a point from which they then spread out spherically, hit the object. Some of the waves come back again to the transducer, which is now a receiver, and from there the electrical signal goes to the multiplier as before and mixes with the reference coming through the phase shifter as before and onto to record the hologram. Now, you may not be convinced that we can make such a transducer which will in fact focus in that manner. This is the actual transducer we use, and the surface is dished or concave, as I was just describing. But to convince you that this thing actually works, let's look at some Schlieren pictures. This first one shows you a shadow at the top of the concave surface which forms the transducer focusing lens. And you can see waves emerging and converging towards a focal point. They then pass through this focal point and emerge the other side as diverging spherical waves. Well, I hope that convinces you. What you may still be unconvinced about is the fact that using such a source of waves, virtually a point source, enables one to produce holograms correctly, because in the past we've talked about using plane waves. So this model is an attempt to do that. Imagine that the vertical lines you can see are rays of a plane wave which is coming down and striking the reflecting facets of an object which we're looking at. These particular rays bounce off those particular facets and converge back onto the transducer. Now imagine the situation the other way around. Suppose the transducer is sending out waves from a point source which is spreading spherically and hitting these same facets on the object under test. And the waves bounce off and go vertically upwards, so of course they miss the transducer. However, if we now move the transducer back to twice the distance, you should be able to see that the waves which leave the transducer hit the reflecting facets and then go straight back to the transducer again. Okay, well, let's look back at the tank again. As I was saying before, we have a carriage below which there's a transducer. And at the moment, it's not moving. If we look at an oscilloscope, we can see a conventional A-scan display from this transducer. On the left-hand side is the transmitter pulse, and then there are two big ones on the right-hand side, the first of which comes from the top surface of the block, and the other one from the bottom surface. On the lower trace, you can see a time gate which selects out the echoes in the region of the block and enables us to suppress echoes which might be bouncing around in the rest of the tank. Now, I'm going to run the scanning in a moment, but notice that as the transducer nears the edges of the block, it passes over the edge and we lose the signals. So let's start scanning. That's the edge of the block, signal's gone. Now we're back on the block again, on the other edge, back again, back with the signals, and I'll stop it just there. Well, those are the signals from the transducer, which of course go to the multiplier, and the other input to the multiplier is of course the reference signal. So let's look at that. It's not moving at the moment because we're not scanning the transducer. So let's start scanning. Well, now you can see that the phase is continuously shifting in synchronism with the movement of the scanning transducer. So let's stop scanning again. Right, well, that's ultrasonic holography. About the only snag at the moment is that it takes rather a long time to scan, make a recording, reduce that photographically to a slide before we can then deal with the reconstruction. So what we're hoping we might do in the fairly near future is to cut out all that by doing it all electronically with microprocessors.
In this program, you've been looking at various ultrasonic techniques for gathering information: straight echo ranging, building up a composite picture with V-scans, ultrasonic holography, and we've looked at materials and medical applications. The next television program for this course will use ultrasonic imaging and X-ray scanning and other techniques as part of a composite attack on a complex medical problem.